What's up, my beautiful people? I have a very special episode for you today. The man to my right is none other than Kyle Jachney. He has over 40 years experience in boats. At one point of his life, he was doing 1,000 charters a year down in the Caribbean. His dad and his family started Caribbean Yacht Charters, is what it was called, right?
One of the very first bareboat companies in the Caribbean.
And at the end of this video, we're going to have a Q&A session from our live stream with you guys where we didn't get a chance to answer those questions. So if you'd like to just see that part, skip to the end of the video. But if you'd like to see the meat and potatoes on what kind of affordable cruisers Kyle has a ton of experience with, we're going to talk about that today. So, Senor Kyle.
All right, what do you want to
know? I'd like to talk with you about your formative years in the chartered industry and see exactly what kind of boats are your favorites, what kind of boats are something to watch out for. Like what type of boats are we going to talk about today? The Irwins, the Tyanas?
Yeah, I mean, my particular experience back in the heyday of American kind of U.S. production, back in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, before some tax laws changed, there were some great builders, Gulfstar, Irwin yachts, certainly Morgan, Endeavor. We dealt with our charter fleet. We dealt with Morgans, Endeavors. We actually had some Sabres in our charter fleet for several years.
Cool.
During that same period, there were other companies that were, really also very strong in developing CNC yachts. There's so many great. O'Day, Pearson was another great builder back in the day. That was a period in the 70s going to the 80s when they were starting to understand fiberglass production better. So they were getting away from the super heavy layups. They were still stout, but they were kind of get away from that. Well, if 12 layers is good, 20 must be better mentality. So they were starting to get a little better on that. CNCs, which were great performance style vessels, less cruising but more performance. Those the earliest years of like J-boats. The J24s when they first came out. But from a cruising standpoint, there were some great designs back then. And again, our experience in a lot of the charter industry, Irwins, Gulfstars, Morgans, Endeavors dominated that field. It was a good almost decade before the French companies like Beneteau and Jeanneau and some of the other production European guys started to get into the charter side in the Caribbean.
So I haven't announced this yet, but my book just won the Eric Hoffer Award for the best self-published book of 2026. Be the Captain has resonated with over 11,000 of you, and I'm so happy. I'm over the moon excited to tell you that we have partnered with Defender.com. So every single person that orders the book gets a 10% off coupon for Defender and Predict Wind. Every person that orders the book gets 20% off Predict Wind subscription. So it's keeping you guys safe. It's helping you guys get gear. It's helping you refit your boats. And it's packed full of information from 90,000 miles at sea. Hope you like it. Go get one. BeTheCaptain.com. Enjoy the talk with Kyle.
So what were your favorite style of boats back then?
Well, I mean, they were comfortable boats, right? I mean, you just didn't think about the performance as much. I mean, there were even boats like the West Sail 32.
Did you have any of those in your fleet?
No, we didn't, but I knew several owners who had them. And I mean, if you're not familiar with the West Sail 32, I mean, that is quintessentially a tank of about 32 feet with the interior volume of like most 40-footers, right? And it can take you anywhere in the world. And I think there were 1,100 of them so built.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of them out there.
Yeah, those are tanks.
Yeah, but I mean, the Morgans and the Gulfstars they hit the marks for it in the size, right? Morgan had that Morganite Island 41, the popular one, the 46. We actually had one of those as a family for 14 years. Cruised everywhere with it. Loved that boat.
You liked it? Would you have sailed that boat around the world?
At the time, I thought I would. I was kind of thinking I was going to with our family. And, certainly would have felt, you don't have the understanding of the safety equipment now and the upgraded levels of everything. We're so much more aware of, every little element of, the quality of rigging and mechanical fittings and charging systems and batteries and all this stuff. It wasn't that way back then, right? People just went, right? I mean, it's that old saying that more Catalinas have sailed around the world than anybody. And then again, more Catalinas have sank than anything else. So, but those are really good. I mean, ultimately, they're really stout boats. The bottom line is if you hit something, you're going to be pretty safe. And my father ran into a lot of rocks up in Maine over the years, and they just bounced off, and we just kept going. But they were good boats.
So what was actually in your fleet? I remember you said you had Gulfstars.
We had Morgans primarily. We also had some Islanders. We did Islanders. Remember the Islander 36, I think it was. We had Morgan 32s, 38s, 41s, 46s. We never did the 60. The Gulfstar 50 was a very popular boat, particularly in the crude yacht side of the business. And then the most popular in the larger crude yacht side, i.e. with the captain and cook, crew, were the larger Irwins. Irwins were huge down there, because Irwin built they built their 44, I think it was a 43 Mark II. They had some boats in that size range, which were fantastic. But they also built a 62, a 65, a 68, and I think a 70 something, with like jacuzzis on the deck. And Ted Irwin, those guys, Charlie Morgan, Ted Irwin, those were the mainstays of that industry. My father, good friends with all of those guys. And Ted could design space into a boat, man. He could, there was, of all the boats, I probably wouldn't encourage taking an Irwin around the world without some real good reinforcement. But man, if you're just going to hang out and go to the Caribbean or the Bahamas, it's a tough boat to beat, for an older boat. And there's some good ones with good value out there.
Why would you say that they would not be as good for around the world?
Well, structurally, they weren't quite as sound they weren't as stout. He truly built them for space. And to the point of, I think at times, sometimes compromised some of the structural aspects of the vessel. And he acknowledged it too, but he just, like he said, that's not where my boats go. My boats are hanging out in the Caribbean.
Okay, one thing I really wanted to talk to you about is the partially skegged rudder on your new boats, on most of the Hylases, right?
All the Hylases, no, I shouldn't say that, not all the Hylases. When we started off initially, we got involved with Hylas in the mid-'80s. I was still in college, and we got involved with them in 84, 85. And back then, the Hylas 44, the original Stevens 47, which prior to it becoming the Hylas 47, was contracted for Bill Stevens to put into charter, and he had a fleet in Nanny Key. So those boats were fully skegged rudders. The reason why we moved away from that is these boats were in charter, and we saw everything, and I always joke, if there's one underlying theme of our charter guests, it's skilled, a little less skilled. They were 90% inebriated all the time. So, they just got into the plane to fly down. They had drinks. They landed. They got drinks. They're drinking on the taxi to the boat. And, I would always tell them during checkouts that, try to pay attention to these few things, i.e. the reefs. You don't want to hit Johnson's Reef, a few other areas cutting around the backside. There are places, Anegada, places you'd be careful. And then, of course, talking about in-mast furling, which is a whole nother topic, but
we'll get to that one.
Yeah, but as a result of that, a number of our boats annually would hit and have problems. And when we had fully skegged boats, that usually meant the skeg was either broken or jammed into the rudder, and then the rudder was basically incapacitated. And it happened. I always had at least one, sometimes two boats through the season that we couldn't use for that reason. So,
and then you'd have to cut the whole skeg off and make it again, and put the.
I have to do skeg, and then most often replace the rudder. Yeah, replace the rudder. So, which is why we ended up starting going with the semi-balanced design with a 60% skeg. So we have a larger chord length forward and aft on the skeg, but it's structural and yet sacrificial in the bottom 40%. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. And the advantage of that versus, say, just a straight spade rudder, balanced rudder, which performance-wise is fantastic, right? But you don't have the third set of bearings and that type of those advantages. So, but the earlier boats and a lot of the older boats you're going to find not only have, like Island Packet, right? The early Island Packets, not only are they full keel, but their full keels are built straight into the rudder. And of course, in all of those, the dynamics are such, you have to worry about, flow. Where does the flow disconnect when it goes around a skeg or a full keel in front of the rudder? And then how does it reconnect? Where does it reconnect? For efficiency. That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, hydrodynamics. A lot of people don't understand the hydrodynamics are even more important than the aerodynamics of your rig. You can put a taller and taller rig on it, but if your hydrodynamics under the boat cause a lot of cavitation and a lot of friction, you're just going to be slow.
Or just simply they're not attaching properly, right? So you're not attaching well, so you don't have great steerage. So it affects balance and everything else on the boat too.
What do you think about Island Packets, just as a sideway?
Stout boats, man. They're well built. People sail them everywhere. Again, So like all these boats, like a lot of these boats, full keeled, full hulled vessels, they don't go upwind very well. And then some are simply slower than others. Island packets are probably a little slower, but then like a West Sail 32 is a little slower. A C&C is a great sailing boat, but a little more vulnerable. Morgan is good, but doesn't go upwind. Those type. Everybody has everything's a compromise. And so, speed matters, right? So speed matters in getting out of the way and safety and getting from point A to point B. So they are comfortable. I had a client I built a boat for recently that he had an Island packet 35 prior. And I helped him sail it from west coast of Florida around Marathon, Keys, Marathon. And then we cut across into the Bahamas over to the Berries. And I could tell you, it was a very comfortable boat. 35, it was a comfortable boat. So cool. Comfortable boat. So again, the routes are, if you're going from the East Coast, you're going to the Caribbean, it's typically, you've got either, the old Donald Street approach is, don't wait till November. He always would encourage people to go to Bermuda in September. Because that's the nicest, calmest time frame. Leave the boat there, and then just go pick it up 6 weeks later after the hurricane season passed. You do the 4 days out to Bermuda, and then do the 4 or 5 days from there down to the Caribbean.
Oh, that's a good idea. I didn't think about doing that, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
you're risking a little bit.
There's a slight inherent risk of, but hurricanes can go anywhere. But Bermuda in general is, percentage-wise, it's on the low end. But you bring it out early. If you go in September, the weather. It's very stable then. It's October, November, it starts to become less stable.
December also, man. I got run over, dude. Bad. Yeah. It's like 55 knots out there.
Yeah, it's a whole nother ball game. But, you can plan the stream well, get through the stream, get to Bermuda, wait. So that's what he would do. So if you're taking a boat like an Island packet, I would kind of plan it in stages like that. Going through the Bahamas, people say, I'll go the easier, I'll bounce down to the Caribbean route. That's all well and good, but, there are passages that are not easy. Mona Passage is not an easy passage, from the DR over to Puerto Rico. It's not much. It's only, it's a short, but it's not that short,
Anytime you have a passage between two islands, in Hawaii, it's really bad. Those passages get up to like 60 knots in there.
Yeah. No, I've seen it whistle through there. I've never sailed out there. I've been diving out there, but I've seen it just being even on the dive boats.
So let me ask you another question. A lot of these people that are watching are first-time sailors or new sailors. This is first-time boat buyers. They're not looking for the fastest boat, the best pointing boat. They're looking for something that will keep them safe when they inevitably screw up.
Yeah, and also, I know in your realm, especially the YouTube thing, that a lot of people are willing to say, I'm going to fix this boat up, and I'm going around the world. And, from somebody who has grown up sailing my entire life and has seen everything, the good, the bad. I've had friends end up in life rafts. I've had friends lost at sea. I've had friends killed offshore. I've had friends killed racing. Ultimately, it's like anything else, whether you're mountain climbing or racing cars or whatever, there's an element of risk to it, right? So, so I'm not out there encouraging anybody to pick up any boat and just without experience and getting out there. Having said that, there are a lot of good boats that you can feel really good and safe in, and you can start off by sailing the East Coast, sailing the Bahamas, getting to the Caribbean. West Coast is difficult because there's nowhere to start. And you go in California, it's downwind, down current to Mexico. Mexico's got fantastic cruising, especially in the Sea of Cortez, but it's limiting compared to
in between. There's nothing
in between. It's very limiting. There's not much in between, and so most folks start here on the East Coast, and then of course then the Med's a whole other ballgame. We were fortunate to be in the Med last summer working, and man, it's tough to. If I'm going to find a boat and hang out and cruise somewhere, why people don't start in Europe?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And then everything's downwind from there too.
Well, it's downwind if you're coming back, but if you're over there, you can spend years over there. Food's fantastic. It's a lot less expensive here than the States. Beautiful. The cruising's beautiful. Just there's a lot to be said for it.
Yeah. So the viewers that are American, that are looking for boats to start this life, their cruising journey, you would suggest looking on the East Coast of the United States?
There's no shortage of boats, man. There's tons of boats, right? There are tons of boats.
It's not too challenging.
No, listen, unfortunately, it's the yacht world mentality. You've got kind of one listing place to go. There are a few other places, but you can ask around. But you have to. any boat, if you're looking at boats, whether you're spending $25,000 or $250,000, you're going to put money into any boat you buy to upgrade, whether it's the sails, electronics, equipment, structural work, whatever it is. You see some of these YouTube channels where they actually do full-on blowout reconstruction of the vessels. And
you don't want to do that.
Yeah, that just makes content, right? That makes content.
Yeah,
but as far as actually,
that kills dreams.
Yeah, kills dreams is right. Yeah, if you want to just get out there, and there's some good boats. I'm actually kind of pleased and surprised to still see how many of the late '70s, early mid '80s Morgans that are out there.
Yeah,
and actually there are more Gulfstars. But we had this conversation recently. I mean, like if I were going to look for a boat and I had a limited budget. Gulfstar and Bristol, and particularly Bristol yachts. So,
I like Bristols.
So there are some really nice boats out there.
They're
outside of those other boats I named. Bristol yachts. Bristols are fantastic, beautiful boats. Great sailing boat too.
Any model specifically that you like?
So they had some great models. They have the 35 Bristol 35 is not only a really comfortable boat for its size, but it's actually a good performing boat. I see a lot of them club racing and holding their own. But the Bristol built, there's a 41, there's a 47, the aft cockpit. There are a few others in that size range, but in the mid 30s to mid 40 foot range, Bristols are really well built boats.
I remember having this conversation with you, and you said that the aft cockpit you preferred. Why was that?
No, just on the 47.
Why?
It was a really comfortable cockpit. It was just a nice cockpit. And it had a really nice quarter berth. Most of these boats, the quarter berth can be a little compromised. And the quarter berth and the aft cockpit and the cockpit itself were nice. That was one of the few that I really like along those lines. So that Bristol, Gulfstar also made in the mid 30s to low 40 foot range. The Gulfstar's got some great designs in there. The early Tianas. Now the earlier Tianas were double enders. Remember the 42? Yep. 37, the 42.
Very popular boat, by the way. I see those out cruising all the time.
It's like the original Pacific Sea Crafts.
Also very good boat.
American Sea Craft, Valiant.
Another American-made boat.
All double enders, all great offshore boats. One of the things you have to look at when you're looking at older boats, and people have a tendency to look at, of course, the things that matter: electronics, rigging, rig, sails, engine, obviously hours. And don't let the hours. I'm always surprised that people say, "Oh, this engine's got 5,000 hours, 6,000 hours." We had 14,000 hours on our diesel.
What's funny is I just put a video out that said, if it has over 5,000 hours, just, be a little bit weary of it. The thing is, you were maintaining it as a charter fleet, right?
Yeah. And,
well, that's the difference, dude.
Well, yeah, have to maintain them. Now, granted, so a lot of the earlier boats you're going to find are not going to be the higher RPM engines like the Yanmars you find now. They were the older Perkins, right? The Perkins was a very popular engine back then.
And I ran my Perkins at like 1900.
Well, that's it. You ran them 16, 18, 1900, and the lower RPMs, and they're old like tractor engines. They just go forever. So if they're well maintained, I'd be less concerned about the hours. They're very maintainable engines to look at. One of the things you have to look at that people don't, it's kind of the low in the thought process, is the plumbing.
Plumbing. I always redo the plumbing on every boat I buy.
Well, that's it. You end up in a lot of, and particularly the boats, early boats, not as much on the U.S. They didn't do the U.S., but they did do it. You find a lot more fiberglass and aluminum tanks, but the boats built in Asia, particularly, as well as, I'm not sure about Pacific Sea Craft or some of the others, but you'd find that they would have black iron tanks.
Yeah.
And so that's something you have to pay attention to, but that's
not a good thing. You have to end up going and like cutting those up into pieces and getting them out, and then putting plastic tanks. Well, in this day and age, you can put plastic tanks, but let me just say this. If you have a boat, it is not that much money to buy Propex and all the connections that go with Propex. It's called Up-Nor Propex, and redo your boat. And you can even buy the tool. Everything together. I did my Morgan Out Island 41. It cost me $700. I did my Oyster 485. It cost me about $1,200. If you're getting...
No, it's top of the line stuff and it's easy.
Yeah.
That's truly one of those that actually falls under that very comfortable DIY type of
just do
category.
That job. Plan on doing that job.
Yeah, that's one that's very manageable.
Yeah. So talk to me about the other boat models. We talked about Irwin. We talked about Morgan. We talked about Bristol.
On the higher end of scale, there was boats like Alden, which are stunning boats.
Those are beautiful boats.
Alden, Hinckley,
Everybody
of course, Little Harbor.
Well, what do you think about these models? Give me like a pros and cons, what they did well, what they didn't do well. I know like for instance, the little harbors, they were a whale bottom.
Yeah, whale bottom because they did center boards.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you
which
like
is interesting. I like them when they have a true keel foot, even with the centerboard. So there's some tracking stability there. Yeah. But having said that, they did very well. And Ted Hood was a great designer and a great sailor and an America's Cup winner. But yeah, those were very popular. I mean, if you look at Hinckleys now, I mean, I hate to say it, but a Hinckley, people who bought a Hinckley in the 70s, they maintain it like they bought it last year.
Yeah.
That's one of the rare models and designs out there that you're looking at a 1974 Hinckley, Bermuda 42. That's not a $50,000, $100,000 boat. That's approaching $200,000 still for a boat like that. So that's a whole nother. If you want a truly classic, stunning boat, those are.
They're a little thin for modern day standards.
Yeah.
Like you'll get a lot more interior volume in most of the boats that you buy today. Yeah. But those boats are so pretty.
They're also shorter on the waterline too.
Are just
gorgeous. They're gorgeous.
Didn't you get one in trade for a newer boat?
I did, yeah.
What was it, a 50?
Southwest 50, yeah. And the only reason I did because I love the boat. I was kind of hoping we'd keep it.
Really?
Yeah,
really?
I did.
That's funny.
Yeah, I love beautiful boat. I bought one of my first boats that I owned, which one of my favorite boats I ever owned was a 72 Tartan 34.
Really?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Love that boat.
Really?
Love that boat.
They perform well. They're built pretty well.
Perform well. Board up and only drew 4.5 feet. With board down, it drew 10 feet. Great performance. The boat I bought had been around the world twice.
Cool.
Yeah. I've been around the world twice. Great sailing boat. A bit of weather helm. Little overpowered on the sail plan forward. But yeah, the early Tartans, fantastic. Designs, loved them, and great cockpits. So, yeah, that was still one of my favorite boats.
Really?
Yeah.
I see, my buddy has one. If you're watching JP, much love. He's sailing around the world on it. His is a bit beat up, but it's still going, man. I think it's the same era, 75 or something.
In the boat that we started our charter fleet with in the late 60s, and the boat that my sister and my parents were basically living on in St. John was the Alden Vega 27.
Oh, wait a minute. So your parents lived in the house and you guys lived on the Alden Vega?
No, we were on the boat.
All of you?
Yeah.
No way.
We were older kids. They didn't care. And they were just starting the business. So, that's how it started.
That's a super famous boat. Matt Rutherford just took that boat on a nonstop circuit around the Americas through the Great Passage. What do they call it? The Northern
Passage.
Yeah, and then down around Cape Horn.
Yeah, that's a feat. I had a friend who did it on a Valiant 40, and I thought that was still pretty
crazy
and brave. So, and a friend, Brad Storm, actually used to do all of our original rigging. In fact, Rick, who worked for him, is doing our rigging now here. Brad went around the world twice solo on an Alden Vega 27. Yeah.
Non-stop?
Don't need a big boat.
When people do that, is it non-stop? Or is it...
No, he stopped. He stopped.
Yeah.
He stopped different places, but he did twice around. He actually met his wife second time around in South Africa. So I think the latter part of that, from South Africa to Brazil and the Caribbean, his now wife, they've been together for like 30-something years.
That's cool.
Yeah, she joined him for that last leg. So almost 2 full circumnavigations.
He sails in and just scoops up this beautiful woman from South
Africa. Yeah.
Okay, so question time. We did a live stream that got cut off because of internet problems, and we got a bunch of questions, and I'm going to read off those questions now, and I want you to tell me what you think.
So we're going to help you with.
So this question, the first question is from Jay Vandening. So James, how about the lead-bolted keel? Oh no, I knew this would come up. I didn't know it would be the first question. Yeah. I can imagine that they need to come off in time, especially after 40 plus years. Is that a possible reason not to buy one?
You know what? Honestly, no, and I've never seen that happen ever. I've built almost 400 Hylases, but even the Hylases built prior to our involvement in the earliest of the 44s and the 42s that were out there, and they're still out there. those boats were built over 40 years ago and going strong. I mean, if it's done properly, the way, I mean, the keel bolts are, integrated deep into the keel, going in through the boat. There should be virtually no exposure, right? I mean, it's supposed to be sealed.
They shouldn't have water at all.
No, I mean, nowadays they seal it. There's sealant. There's 5200. It should be glassed around the edges. I mean, properly, these really should, at best, if you want to drop a keel and take a look at the bolts, I understand people do that. At best, you should see maybe maybe just a little bit of, you shouldn't see anything structural at that nature. Now, what you have to be cognizant of when you're looking at any boat, older or newer, is if it's an externally bolted keel and the boat's been put through its paces or used a lot, or you have questions, take a look if it's a yacht that's built where the keel bolts are in line, linear, or where they're in parallel. Parallel bolts obviously don't have the risk of torque and lateral torsion that boats in a single line do, and that's something that you have to be cognizant of. But I've never seen that to be a problem, and I'm still friends with the owner of the very first Hylas 44. That's a 1983, 84 boat, who's still the original owner, by the way, out in San Francisco.
No way.
He sailed that boat twice around, circled the Pacific twice. I don't think he's gone past that, and he's never brought the boat to the East Coast. So, yeah.
I'll add one thing that I heard from Valiant when I was talking to them about a Valiant 42. They said, do not touch the keel bolts on our boats. When we put them on, they're big keel bolts, and they're put on with a huge breaker bar at like 400 PSI, and it actually galls the bolt to the nut, and it elongates. It can elongate the bolt a little bit, and just, that's the way it should be in tension like that. And don't
the torque
mess
numbers
with it.
You're not supposed to mess with.
Don't mess with it. Why are you dropping it? You shouldn't be dropping it.
There has to be a reason. There has to be a reason. The only time I've dropped one in the last decade is a Hylas 70 that went up hard on the rocks in Maine. I mean, hard to the point the entire 110,000 pounds ended up launching itself on the rocks and took the rig off the boat. And then we dropped the keel, and the keel was fine. So.
Yeah, so don't watch too much YouTube. The guys that are buying a Jachney and dropping the keel bolts and changing them and stuff, that's not a normal thing.
Yeah, and there's probably a linear set of keel bolt design too.
Yeah, regardless, I think a lot of people are just doing it like this. Like, he's asking, should I be worried? Should I drop the keel bolts and look at them? Is this a normal kind of...
it should be no different than stainless, honestly, an interior structure. It shouldn't really be.
I don't think you should mess with it. If it's not leaking, don't mess with it. All right. This one is from Shogun, SV Shogun, the refit choice. Yeah. If you were to refit a 30 to 40 footer from the 80s, which would you choose for coastal cruising?
Which boat?
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a wide. I mean, honestly, I guess I'm a little particular. Depending on the size. I mean, I do think the Hylas 44 we were originally building is a quintessentially fantastic boat. But there are other great boats in that time frame. Some people like the comfort and the sailing characteristics of the Valiant, of a Hans Christian. I think a boat that performs both of those, I do think that Hylas 44, and there's actually an aft cockpit 42 that was made. It draws a little more, but that was a great boat. I mean, there are a lot of good boats in that size. I mean, that's so subjective. That gets down to what you have to put into it. Cost.
Well, no, he said 30 to 40 footer.
Oh, 30 to 40 feet.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, 30 to 40 feet. With that, now I'm going to be preferential to my Tartan 34.
Yeah, you think that's the best one? I was just saying that
to you off camera. I mean, that was still my favorite. It was an awesome boat. The Tartan 37 is a great boat. I had friends who did a circumnavigation on a Tartan 37 and loved it. And not only that, but I remember they had scheduled themselves for 3 years in the Med, as part of they had a 7-year circumnavigation, 3 years of which we're going to wrap up 3 years in the Med. And I was fortunate to be working in the Med for several summers, and I had a chance to get together with them. And at that stage, they were then 7 years into their Med period, cool. And the whole trip they figured was now going to go from 7 years to 12. Yeah. So, I mean, but the Tartan, those earlier Tartans, I would say they're better boats than the Sabres, the earlier Sabres. I would take a Tartan over those. But again, Pacific Seacraft, again, great boats. It all depends where you're going, costs, and what needs to be done to it. But yeah, there are a few that people are certainly go-tos, I mean, most people think back to that time frame, and they'll think Island Pack, but I would take a Valiant over that. But I mean, I do of the American builders.
Hinckley.
But a Gulfstar. We talked about this before. I would take a Gulfstar of those made for the people think of Irwin, Gulfstar, Morgan, Endeavor. I would take them as far as taking them offshore. I'd start with a Gulfstar, Morgan, and then Endeavor, Irwin, kind of at the bottom of that list.
Where does Sabre come in there?
Sabres are great boats, but they're built for really good coastal cruising, I think, more so than the Tartans were. And I don't think it was intended that way. I just think structurally they ended up being that way. Sabres are great sailing vessels, the newer designs, Jim Taylor that did, and they're more performance oriented. But the earlier versions back in the early 80s, again, I would 70s, 80s, I'd go back to Tartan again.
Okay.
Tartan, I mean, there are other ones that are out there as well. Hans Christian is a boat I liked.
Since you did mention the Valiant and the 80s boats, I will just add a little bit of a disclaimer where there was an oil embargo in 74. There was a weird mix of resins that was going on in late 70s. So sometimes those late 70s, early 80s boats can have blisters on them. So just make sure you're not buying a huge project, because the fix for that, while it's not going to sink your boat, is a big job.
Well, to that next point, almost all of those boats built that period until later in the mid 2000s, later 2000s, they were all done with polyester resins. And didn't have epoxy barrier coats before bottom paint went on. So they were polyester resins, and pretty much all of them were prone to some sort of osmotic blistering, surface blistering, osmotic blistering as a result of that. The newer boats now, everybody does vinyl ester resins. You also are not going to find tinned wiring in any of those boats. You're not going to find epoxy with the waterline below. You're going to find polyester resins. You're going to find wiring that wasn't tinned. These are all things that really, those are the production, manufacturing, evolution stages that took place in the 90s and 2000s that you don't see in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, cool. I didn't know that. All right, next. Noxon 8 Resurrection says, is it true that 85s, the boats from 1985s, will be hard to get insurance and marinas don't let you in?
Well, you can't single out that 1 year. I'm not sure why that 1 year was singled out, but in general, you're going to find that once boats get past, insurance companies will start putting caps. They do. They like that Hinckley that we took in trade, couldn't get it insured.
Oh no!
Yeah, could not finally get insured, but for minimal. I mean, really tough to get insured, even though it was a great boat in mint condition. And, it was less than $200,000. You're not insuring a huge amount of cost here. So insurance is always going to be a problem. Some marinas, it's not about the quality or the type of boat. If you bring in a 79 Hinckley in mint condition, no one's going to say no. But they don't want to see some sort of dilapidated boat that people have been living on in South Florida that haven't been taken care of. So it's more of, they're prone to want to have boats that look like they've been maintained. But insurance is an interesting question, because all the different insurance companies have a period, whether it's 25 years, 40 years, where they say, okay, we just don't insure at that stage. Yeah. And a lot of them, because of the pricing, the reality is most owners self-insure at that stage.
Well, I will tell you that this is a very common question for me, and you can usually get liability insurance for a boat, even a 40-year-old boat, and that's what you need to get into a marina. So your question is kind of convoluting two different things. You can usually get a boat into a marina as long as it's not a wood boat, because a lot of marinas restrict them because they sink. They're kind of always sinking. And, don't worry about that. But the full coverage insurance, the hull insurance is what we're talking about. And that is difficult to get after the boat turns, especially 40.
That was a good point. Yeah, the liability is easier to get than that.
Yeah, I just want to make sure everybody got that clear. All right, next one is from Michael DeBure. He says, I have a Macintosh 47 that had the keel bolts glassed over and the fuel tanks overbuilt. It's a 1989 boat that has circumnavigated, no leaks, no keel seam visible. Should I be concerned?
So you don't see the keel seam, because if it was done properly, they were sealed together, and then a good builder will sand down and put glass around that seam. It's non-structural, but it's there for protection. So, no, I mean, his bigger concern are just the tanks on the interior, right? I mean, checking the seams. Of course, back then they weren't doing TIG welding. They were probably using 304 stainless, or maybe aluminum, who knows, or it could be black iron tanks, so the material of the tanks, the seams, does the tankage have inspection plates? If they have inspection plates, great, because you can get in there, you can clean, you can inspect, you can do work on the corners and the welds.
Yeah, I would say it's not a horrible job to cut the tanks out and get some plastic tanks made too, because nowadays you can get poly tanks in any shape you want. You just draw it out on a piece of paper and send it in, and they'll send you a tank.
But not the keel. Again, the keel's not a concern for them, but that concern about the tanks, that's, like I said before, the plumbing is an area that people should pay attention to.
Okay. Mr. Musket Thunder. What a great name. I like Musket Thunder. He says, James, Hylas 44 for $18,500 in Florida. Says engine is running, but needs TLC. That's always the catch-all, needs TLC.
So if it's $18,000 and it says TLC, that would fall into the understatement category, right?
Yeah.
So if it's available, if that boat's available and it hasn't sunk and it's actually $18,000, it's in the bottom of my backyard, not in my backyard, because that boat is a fantastic boat. I'm saying good ones, they're typically listing between 100 to literally up to 200. So
yeah, they're like $140,000 boat.
At 18 grand, that's been walked away from and probably needs everything, but. So that is a six-figure project, most likely.
Yeah, even if the engine's running, you probably have some structural issues on that thing.
And I wouldn't even be concerned about as much structural as just everything else. I mean, but everything else adds up. The sum of its parts adds up quickly. Yeah. Rigging, sails, electronics, plumbing, pumps. He's into a price where you can just go and, unless you have an extra spare 2 years in your life. A
lot of these guys do. And what kind of tanks did you guys use when you first made those?
Those are stainless back then. They were stainless, but they were 304 stainless. They weren't 316.
Yeah,
it wasn't TIG welding. So I mean, that's an area that if people took care of them and cleaned them and didn't leave them, check them, they can go a long time.
Yeah.
So. But yeah, I hear $18,000 boat and I just think, okay, I hope the other 100 is ready to be spent.
There's a reason it's for 18.
Yeah, there's a reason for that. Yeah.
I'll say one thing. I've done this 4 times. I've had 7 boats. I've done it 4 times where I revived a boat where I got it real cheap and revived it. I will not do it again. Yeah. I'm done with that. I'm not going to revive another freaking sailboat. It takes forever. Like the Oyster 45 that I just sold, it took me 5 years to get that boat nice.
So I bought my Tartan 34 for $22,000.
Yeah.
it was in good shape. But there's still things you needed. I wanted better sails. We found out we did need some rigging. We had to do work on one of the starboard chain plates, and as a result, in the starboard bulkhead and so on. When all was said and done, and then I wanted new electronics. I was 35 into it just on the upside. So bottom line is, it became a 65, and it could have easily been a $75,000 boat, which then opens the doors for a lot of folks. So there's no $40,000 boat you're just going to take off on.
I'll tell you what, I think there's a strong case for waiting to buy until you have the money and buying something that's mostly finished.
Let somebody else do the work.
Yeah. So next one is Nick James. Nick says, "Hey Graham, see if Kyle can get to the bottom of this. What happened to Camper and Nicholson?"
So it's kind of like New England Boat Works. They're really good. They're up in the Great Lakes, Camper Nicholson and Wisconsin. Great builder. But again, a lot of their boats were larger boats that went into charter, and they were doing larger, luxury yachts, larger boats. They're beautiful boats that they built, but it's just the economy. I mean, it's just a very difficult economy to make work. I think it's actually still a functioning yard. I don't know. Yeah, it's
they're not making boats.
They're not making boats. Haven't built boats in decades. But they were a great builder that suffered the test of time and the economy. I mean, the reality is more really good boat building at that level started taking place over in Europe. And what took place in Asia were much smaller designs. You weren't finding larger yachts / sailboats or larger private yachts or custom builds. That wasn't happening in Asia, still isn't happening in Asia. That's only happening in Europe now.
Okay. Infinite Cell says, the old boats from the late 60s to early 80s, solid fiberglass. Did the fiberglass ever delaminate?
No, more often than not, you just had blistering issues because they didn't do coring back then. They didn't delaminate. You would have some saturation issues a little bit, particularly in decks, because people wouldn't think, really clearly about, all builders now are really good about making sure any through deck fittings, whether it's a rigging fitting or anything of that, cleats or whatever it is, are done through solid glass no matter what. But there was a lot more coring in the deck back then, just was not in the hull at the time, and that was just a weight savings design issue. And we all had that. But no, the difference is late 60s to the 80s, that layup schedule changed dramatically.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but they realized, again, the same thing. If 12 is good, 20 is better mentality, they really did not need the 20. So they've found the right formula to they learned what they did not need to do. So ultimately, you never hear anybody talk about late 60s boats. My boat was in early 70s, and that's really when things started to get a little better, and they kept improving they continue to improve. Now you're finding different fibers and everything else.
Okay, next question is from Tegan Dima. He says, what's your opinion on a Catalina 30 as a cruiser starter boat?
So a good buddy of mine in Santa Barbara had the 32, Catalina 32. And he used to cruise that boat a lot. And that was a blast. We used to take that to the Channel Islands and go diving off of it. And so the Catalinas through the 80s and the 90s, great boats. That Catalina 36 is a great boat.
That is a good boat.
Catalina 36, I liked it better than the 38. I liked it better than the 42. The 36 is a great all-around boat. If you could step it up from the 30 to a 36, that's the way to go.
I met a girl. This is a cool story. I met a girl on a Catalina 30. I met her twice. I met her once in Panama, and I met her again in Ecuador. And she had sailed that boat from Seattle. And when I met her, the way I met her was she was knocking on my hull, and I was like, "Hey, what's up?" She goes, "Can you help me out?" I was like, "Yeah, of course." Okay, we're gonna change my cutlass bearing in the river, in like 1 inch of visibility, and with her boyfriend, he had a kiteboarding pump, duct taped to a hose, duct taped to a snorkel. And she did it. She was a badass, dude.
Yeah.
And they ended up having to, this is a use case that's far over to the right, but they ended up having to reglass every single bulkhead. They delaminated everything. They ripped out all of the cleats on the boat. That boat is not made to do that. Okay.
No, they're not made for those. No. But again, some of them are stouter than others, and the earlier Catalinas were good, pretty good boats.
Yeah. I lived on a Catalina 27 for a year.
Oh.
I had one.
And you're still here.
I'm still here. It was a great sailing boat. Stravagen says, what's your opinion on a Cheoy Lee Clipper 48?
Cheoy Lee is a great earlier boat. It's right there in the Tashing yard. That's what else was there. Toshiba, remember the Toshiba 40s?
Yeah.
Same area.
Wasn't that where Tayanas were built?
Tayanas were there, all in the same neighborhood. Queen Long, Hylas, Little Harbors were built there. Oh, no. Little Harbor was all built there. That was when it was all sailing then, no power. Now that whole area is now all trawler central. Ocean Alexander, Johnson, offshore, Nordhaven, Katie Krogan, all these guys are all trawler builders now building in that same part of Asia, and particularly in Taiwan. They're great boats. The early stage Asian boats, they're just things they didn't get down well. I remember we got involved with Hylas. We totally, completely redid their mechanical systems, how they did them. Everything, wiring, everything had to be retaught to them and redone. And that was all based on our charter experience. If we didn't have the charter experience, those boats would not have evolved as they did. And I think I've told you before, it was a West Indian, Dennis James, who was our chief mechanic in St. Thomas from Antiguan, who spent months over there totally redoing the system. But it wasn't just that. We taught them how to redo the hatches, how to do everything kind of had to be stepped up. And so that's an issue a little bit with a number of all those earlier boats, Tartan included, Cheoy Lee, Toshiba, Celestial was over there. There are a number of, again, those earlier boats, growing pains. I'm a big guy, right? I'm not skinny. And I remember going over there for the first time in the 80s, and all the chairs were built for people,
that were smaller.
Kind of smaller, the best way of putting it. And I'm like, this isn't going to work, So you literally had to teach them all of these things about how to build. And so I'm not sure how much some of these other yards went through that process.
Cool. Yeah, that's neat. I tell people with the Cheoy Lees that they are a lot of the time, because those are almost all leaky tikis, that they can be a dream killer. You got to be careful with the Cheoy Lees. I love that design. I love the overhang in the back. I love the lines on the Cheoy Lees, but Jesus, man, most of them are a nightmare for maintenance.
That was it comes down to. So it kind of straying here a little bit, but a common question I would always get is like, what's the cost to own a boat? Take care of a boat. Now, the usual things. Housing's number one. Housing, insurance, just like living in general. But maintaining an engine, whether it's a 46-footer, 56-footer, maintaining engines, parts, pumps, checking systems, all that, it's continuous. Those costs are relatively the same. Those don't increase exponentially with size. To a certain extent do, but in the cruising size, not as much. What changes is the sweat equity. How much sweat equity you put in the boat, how much time of washing, waxing, polishing, stainless. And those early boats, they were referred to as Taiwanese teak barges for a reason. They were just covered in teak.
Yeah.
Teak was cheap, and they could use a lot of it. And if it's varnished, it's just a lot of upkeep. The varnish alone, if you look at how the boats evolved and how I've built our boats now, we try to keep them as wash and wear on deck as possible.
Yeah, I think the new one that we're commissioning here doesn't have any teak on the top.
No, it's got Flexiteak. It's got Flexiteak, and the bulwarks and everything are all glass. Just like you see with Oyster, just like you see with Swan, just like you see with the Mel, with everybody now. So those older boats, you can look at the engines and the things that have to get worked on, but take all that and multiply the number of hours you have to put into it, because the varnish and the upkeep is tremendous.
Next one, Bogey says, is a Moody 34 a good first boat for offshore?
Again, that gets into where's the comfort size and level for offshore in itself. But no, the early Moody's, the new Moody's now, which are basically built by Hansa, the original Moody's that were being built, very well built boats, British built, right up there with Rustlers, Westerlies. Yeah, so that's a great boat from size-wise. And again, going back to the 80s, 70s and 80s, mid-90s, a 40-foot boat was a big boat back then, right? 50 was, people didn't do 50s. We've evolved into the 50s. So that size of that Moody, yeah, that's a good boat.
I have a buddy that circumnavigated on a Moody 37 with 4 people. Oh, and they were super comfortable.
Yeah. It's the Moody. The early Moody's were well-built vessels. Again, like a lot of the other. Of that range, out of that area of the UK, I think the best one's at Rustler 36. Best one out there.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this right here because I want to know from you guys, are you still watching this, for one? Is it worth me making these hour-long talks? 2, what boats would you actually like to hear about? Leave me a comment in the comment section and then tell me, yes, I like these, no, I don't. Go back to making sailing videos, you bastard. Or, hey, I would like to hear you talk to Kyle about these specific boats. All right? Much love, everybody. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.